So, good afternoon and welcome. We're delighted you can join us for this, the first of our events marking 50 years of women at King's. My name's Laura Davies. I'm one of the fellows here in English, and I'm really happy to be here to welcome you today. So in October 1972, the first cohort of women students, 37 undergraduates and 20 graduate students arrived at King's. Along with Clare and Churchill, we were the first of the all-male colleges to admit women as students. And clearly, this was a landmark decision for us and for Cambridge. Considerable advances have been made since in gender equality, women's education and opportunities, and life here is very different today for King's students, staff and fellows, but there's of course still much more to be done. So as a college, when we started to think about what we wanted to achieve during this anniversary year, we thought that we wanted to look at the impact and celebrate the lives and work of King's women, past and present, and how they trailblaze, inspire and innovate in many different roles across the globe. And importantly, we also wanted to examine how we can do more to bring about further change here in Cambridge and in the wider world. So our two speakers today are a great example on all of these fronts of King's women. Rachel Jupp studied SPS here, followed by an MA in Public Administration at Columbia University. She joined Channel 4's News in 2005 and went on to be the deputy editor of Newsnight, and then in 2016 to be only the second female editor of the flagship current affairs programme, Panorama. She now, as of this summer, works as the editorial executive within the content division at the BBC, providing editorial and strategic support across all TV, radio, children and sports programmes. Eleni Courea read HSPS and was a KCSU president here at King's. She's currently deputy editor of Politico London Playbook, which keeps daily tabs on what's happening in Westminster. She was previously a political reporter at The Times and has been a UK lobby correspondent for 4 years. It's brilliant and enormously timely to have you with us here today to talk, amongst other things, I hope, about how the media can hold power to account. And I'm sure there's going to be no shortage of material for discussion about women, King's women, and the media. So thank you so much for coming back and helping us to get these anniversary events off to a super start. Over to you. Thank you.
So, it's really good to meet you, Rachel, for the first time.
We haven't actually met before, so this is a real-time conversation. Yeah.
I guess the first thing that I want to ask you is, because I'm always interested in this, what was your sort of first break that got you into journalism? Because I remember being in rooms like this and just wondering how people made that first jump from university into the sector.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question, and everybody I think has a different path into journalism, particularly now. And in fact, in some ways, I think the barriers to entry are much lower, because at that point it felt like it was sort of impenetrable to work out how to get into how does papers work. There was just newspapers and TV really, and I was always really interested in the news, but I didn't go straight into the news. And when I was at King's, actually, I did quite a lot of drama and I did quite a lot of politics, but I was like on the college council. I was always interested in how things kind of worked in governance. And I thought that I would be interested in politics. And so when I graduated, I got a job as a secretary, as a PA in a think tank, which was sort of like quite new at that stage. And I quickly realised that the world of politics was not for me. I mean, it was sort of populated by these awful people who were like relentlessly just talking about how they could destroy their rivals. That was like the overwhelming motivation. So I sort of thought, this isn't right for me. I know I'll just go and live in Spain and work in a bar and learn Spanish. That was my plan.
Wow.
And my boss at the time very kindly sort of took me aside and said, go to Madrid. But at the end of a year, like, you might not have that much. What about you go to America and do a master's? And I went to Colombia and I was studying what's called an MPA, which we don't really have here, but there's a lot of government in America at city, state and federal level. So they sort of, it's a bit like an MBA for people who are interested in the public sector. And it was a really good course, but attached to it also within Colombia is probably the best journalism school in the world. And I ended up doing some courses there and thinking, actually, this is really fun because you just get to like ask people what they think. And, you know, I mean, at its core, great journalism is telling people stories. And I started working at the sort of local, the university newspaper. Then I volunteered at the radio station there. And when that came to an end, I just phoned up ITN. ITN makes ITV News and Channel 4 News. And I just said, can I come and intern for you? And they agreed to pay me a bit. I was house sitting in DC and I got to cover, as an intern, I got to cover a presidential campaign. And at that point, I knew that was it, like, because I also have always loved telly and spent most of my childhood just watching television. And if anybody tells you that's a waste of time, they're wrong. And so these two things came together. And then I came back to the UK. I had to, you know, I freelanced for a long time at the BBC, and then at ITV News, and then at Channel 4. And then when I got into Channel 4 News, I was able to move up. So, but I think actually some of those kind of barriers to entry are lower now because there's a lot more news out there. We were just reflecting on how when I was here 20 years ago, something like that, it felt like, you know, journalism wasn't in great shape. What was the future of news? You know, would there be, how much would we value that in the future? Were there opportunities? And it doesn't feel like that now. It feels like there's so many outlets for news and there's so much engagement. And that's, I think, a really positive thing for all of us and for democracy.
It's funny you say that because I remember when I was here and I used to occasionally go to a talk, say at the career service, about getting into journalism or stuff like that. And the kind of thing they would always say is, oh, well, journalism is going through big challenges now. There's no money in it. You know, newspapers are in decline, their readership is in decline. It's not, you know, the age where you could get a job at a newspaper, for example, by starting at a local paper and then moving to the nationals. Has ended, and there was just this pessimism and this sort of sense that it wasn't really a good idea to try and get into the industry. And having now got a job in journalism, I really feel like that just wasn't true, and it's having to evolve quite a lot, like most industries are having to evolve with the digital age and all sorts of other sort of changes that society is going through. But there is still so much opportunity there, and there's so many exciting jobs, and yeah, it's a really kind of growing and exciting field to work in.
And what was your first opportunity? What was your first step that got you into?
So it's a good question. I remember when I was at King's, I didn't really do much student journalism. I was always really interested in politics, like you, and I really liked writing. So I just put those two things together towards the end of my degree, and sort of thought that's something that I'd like to try and do. And then two of my friends were moving to London and were going to do a master's at Queen Mary, and I really wanted to live with them. So I was like, I'm going to get a job in London. So what I did was I just applied for jobs. I got a job at a trade magazine, basically, a business-to-business sort of publication. And those are kind of going strong because what they do is they charge sort of readers in a specialist area, in a particular field, for news and news service in that particular area. So I worked for a magazine that was a research policy publication, and I did that for a couple of years, and that was brilliant training because it was just a place where you just got to know what journalism was like, you know, holding people and understanding what a news story is, what you know, what's worth writing about, making a lot of mistakes, but in a place where you haven't got to, you know, nobody will really notice because the readership is quite small, and there's just that freedom to do that, and you can kind of learn. And I did that for a couple of years, and then I got into a scheme which is unfortunately no longer running since COVID, I think, but a scheme that is designed to get young people into the lobby, so into political journalism.
Yeah.
And so it was called the Anthony Howard Award, which you just applied to, did an interview, and then if you got it, then you got to do a year of rotating between national publications. So that was my sort of break into national journalism.
Yeah.
And how have things changed since you started, and sort of what's kind of struck you as different now to?
Well, yeah, I think that in terms of, I suppose there's two really big changes, I think, for me in terms of journalism. You know, editorial kind of values. Obviously, working at the BBC, we think a lot about so-called impartiality, balance, fairness, all those things. You know, those fundamental editorial values on which trust is based, and for your viewers, your readers, your listeners, your users, that the decision is made to come to you, and they stay the same, I think, and they've always been the same, and the risks that sit around that as well, how those things being undermined. But I think for me, the two big things have changed. One is big shift in people's habits, so where they're going to get their news, and some of that is really good because it means there's a huge amount of competition. The tone of like podcasts versus the 10 o'clock news, the tone is very different. Some of that is I think quite dangerous, because when you're getting a lot of your news from like WhatsApp or family groups, and that is how disinformation can spread, but also become really powerful and potent. And COVID, I think, really sort of fast-tracked some of those issues. So the sort of platform, and I think a lot now about, huge amount about audiences and what the BBC makes that works, and why, and what time of day, you know, like it's really interesting. This is sort of slightly beyond news, but you know, news used to be something that people would kind of, they'd do their day, and at the end of the day it'd be like, oh, I wonder what else happened in the world. Stick on the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news. And now news seems to have shifted to people's phones. That's the device that they look for news. And obviously, you know, if you want to, you can find out what's happening all the time. And so the evenings seem to have become a time where people don't actually really want the news anymore. They just want to relax, escape, distract themselves from the news, whatever it is. I think that the amount of news, it's difficult to know, isn't it? Because we've been through a huge time of change in the last 5 years. But I do, in terms of the tone, I do worry that the tone of news has become, as it's become more competitive, it's also become more hysterical. And that's because, you know, in a busy, crowded marketplace, sort of big opinions cut through. So that risk, but the risk is that you leave the audience feeling depressed. There was some new research I was looking at last week from the Reuters Institute that said that 46% of people in this country now actively avoid the news.
God.
Because they're worried about the impact it has on them. So on the one hand, I'd say that platforms have changed, technology has changed the way it's delivered and how people relationship, how people have it. The other thing that I think has changed is, which is partly through technology, is that some of sort of the storytelling around news is changing, I think, in an interesting way. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to go to Panorama, where Panorama is a investigative current affairs documentary strand on the BBC. It's been going for 65 years. And it does one story in depth, one story a week. And sometimes those programs, those investigations, they'll take like 2 years to do one program. Sometimes they'll take a week. You know, you might, if something big's happened, you just do a quick turnaround on it. But providing people with more depth, I think, is a really a good thing that sort of long form audio and long form TV, and also books and those kind of longer reads, magazines actually have become really popular again. Give people who are interested in subjects tend to be really interested in them. And so the opportunity to provide more depth and more context and move away from just the sort of 3-minute news story, or for you, the kind of whatever 300 words, feels like a shift, I would say.
And do you find, sorry, another question that comes to me, but I want to ask you, the pressure on the BBC, do you find that that's something that, the pressure, for example, to be more sensational, does that affect the BBC given its status as the kind of national broadcaster? And is it becoming a more difficult climate to work in with also the government,
Yeah. So, yes. I mean, when I used to work at Channel 4 News, which is kind of, plucky, upstart, loves making a fuss about stuff. And you could just basically get away with nearly anything at Channel 4 News. And then I moved to Newsnight when there was a big BBC blow up around Jimmy Savile and then Lord McAlpine, which for those people who don't remember, BBC sort of totally failed to cover the story of Jimmy Savile being unmasked as a paedophile, and then compounded that mistake by wrongly identifying somebody else as a paedophile who wasn't. So it was like bad. And the Director General resigned, and the Chairman of the Board resigned, and Newsnight was a programme that was really at the centre of that crisis. And so they brought in a new editor, a guy called Ian Katz, who had been with Guardian, and he brought me in as a deputy. And it's worth saying that before that point, I literally thought I would never work at the BBC. I mean, I couldn't work out how anybody ever got a job there. It just seemed like this kind of impenetrable civil service style organisation. And it was good to go in at a kind of senior level, but we started doing things, I mean, not very interesting things, but just like a few different things. And they would just be on the front page of the Daily Mail the whole time. The scrutiny that you get at the BBC, particularly from the rest of the press, who basically hate the funding model of the BBC and see the BBC as their competitor, but they are their competitor, is intense. And you get that rightly, because at the moment everybody is required to pay for the BBC who wants to access television. So there's a lot of audience scrutiny. There's a lot of political scrutiny and a lot of political pressure. And those two things, it's difficult to get away from the fact that those two things are related. The BBC's charter is established by the government. And then there's the pressure from your competitors. And I think that, most of the time the BBC gets the balance right. But, at Panorama, where you're running really big investigations, you really can't afford to get that wrong. There's 2 or 3 programs which kind of corporation ending. I would say Panorama was one of them, and is one of them. And I ended up in court. I ended up with security guards outside my house. It's real when you're trying to deal with a huge data leak or unmask an oligarch or whatever you're doing. It's very real, and you feel like it's your responsibility, the responsibility of the BBC to carry out those kind of big investigations, which no other organisation in some cases could afford to do or have the legal support to do. But it doesn't, but it does bring quite a lot of pressure along with it as well.
Oh wow, yeah, that's really sounds terrifying.
Well, the court case was interesting because it was a very big story called the Paradise Papers, where there was a huge data leak out of a law firm. So I think the law firm felt like, I'm going to have to take this on to sue the BBC.
But was it a libel case, or was it?
It was about a breach. Yeah, it wasn't about libel. It was about the
Breach
data
of personal
protection and privacy, and our lawyers kept saying, against that, don't worry, that's settled, don't worry, that's settled. And I was like, yeah, but the case is actually starting in 1 minute, so shall I just go into court and at least be there? So it was fine. It was like, of course we won, but you know, it's the sort of hardest edge, I would say, of journalism, that end of it.
I definitely found it difficult. One of the challenging aspects of the job that I found has been sort of calling somebody when you're writing a difficult story about them and having to tell them, you know, I'm writing this horrible thing about you, or we've got this allegation, or just that kind of confrontation can be quite difficult. And then when often people and then politicians will be quite robust in coming back to you, you know, sometimes,
I can imagine,
and it's no indication of whether or not they're justified. You know, they might have done terrible things and just really lie about it. And we've had politicians in recent years, lots of them who have done that. I mean, it's just always difficult because it always makes you doubt yourself, even if you've completely done all the work and you're 100% sure that what you've got is right. There is always that kind of, when you get that blowback, it's difficult. And it's a question for, I think, you know, organizations how to support journalists, especially kind of relatively new journalists. Because you feel like it's just you know, like you're the person that they're angry at, who's writing this, whose name is on this. And it's just.
And do you find that in terms of pressure, in terms of balance as well? Like, do people get in touch with you? They feel like they haven't been fairly represented, or if you're covering one side more than the other, how does that work?
Definitely. I mean, in every job I've had, that's been an issue. And the one I have now, I mean, it basically involves, I write this newsletter that's, I mean, it's audience.
It's incredibly famous in Westminster and maybe across the world.
but that's the thing, it's sort of a very Westminster focused newsletter.
Everybody reads it,
And that's the audience, it's very targeted. It's sort of like a Westminster bubble publication. It's geared towards people who work in that world. So everybody in Number 10, everybody in the Labour Party, all the MPs, their staff, everybody sort of in adjacent jobs. And basically involves, it's a morning newsletter, it goes out at 7 a.m, and writing it involves staying up overnight and reading everybody else's material, because one of the big aspects of it is collating other people's stories, presenting it in a kind of, you know, making a judgment about what you think the biggest story of the day is going to be. And then collating everybody else's stuff and putting your own stuff in. So you'll have spoken to your own contacts, your own sources, and people in government, people in the opposition, putting all that together. And it's such a challenging thing to do that in a way that, you know, it needs to kind of come out the next morning in sort of several thousand words. And everybody has to feel like at the same time you've done a good job in that you've scrutinized things and, you know, kind of challenge, you've just kind of made a bit of fun of everybody, because it's quite an informal newsletter. It's sort of poked fun, but at the same time treating them fairly and not shown bias either way. And doing that, and especially at like midnight,
3 in the morning. I can imagine that's pretty straightforward.
But that's always a thing. I mean, even in a normal reporting job, just having to feel like you're, and definitely it's very important to be balanced, to be fair to everybody.
And it's interesting, even though the sort of number of outlets that you can access has increased, I think on that, what would be called the mainstream media, the older media, whose institutions that are now adapting to different platforms and technology, there's still a kind of real sense amongst politicians, business community, you know, if it appears on the BBC or on the Times, people will believe it's true. And so obviously for us, that means we've got to be right. And if you're doing an investigation, or if it's a sort of political judgment, you know, it changes the authority that it has. And what I found when I was doing investigations, which you know, we did a lot about Russia, we did a lot about sort of basically dirty money swelling through London. And whenever you take on somebody really rich, they use the law as a sort of arm of PR and communications. So ultimately everything you're saying is true, but they just try and kind of kick up enough legal noise.
And that's an issue now, isn't it, with all the journalists writing about Russian oligarchs?
Yes, yeah, exactly. They kick up enough noise that you just think, is it worth it? Or should we just slightly tone that down, or how do we reflect that? And the effort is all to try and get the programme or the article just sort of toned down. And yeah, I mean, for Putin's people, the various publications that have been sued, particularly by Roman Abramovich, who I think in many ways was a sort of pioneer in kind of whitewashing laundering his reputation through this country, and particularly with Chelsea, that really, everyone's doing it now, but he did it first. And through art and all the institutions, all the cultural institutions that have such meaning for people in this country. And they've got so much money that spending £10 million on a libel case doesn't mean anything, and that's a real threat, I think, to journalism, to free speech. But the counter side of that is when you see social media in Russia or in Iran, you realise that how technology can be the most incredible tool for reporting and for journalism as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And that feels, I feel like, at least in Westminster, for example, Twitter has just become such an essential thing in terms of driving the day. So things will happen and politicians use Twitter to now, I think the most interesting example of that was actually Boris Johnson's resignation. Well, his semi-resignation, when he tried, it was that day when, after the scandal about one of the people he had appointed had faced an allegation, Boris Johnson knew about previous allegations against this person, but gave him that role anyway. He was deputy chief whip. And a lot of people started to resign from the government. And the way they did that was posting their resignation letters on Twitter. So that was, their medium for resigning. It wasn't even, forget kind of actually sending your letter to the Prime Minister. If it's on Twitter and then people just report you resigned, you've done it. And it was just the whole day was driven by this, the news cycle was driven by people using their Twitter accounts to post resignation letters, and sort of a tally of how many had resigned, and it just carried on. In Downing Street, the sort of bunkering down, Boris Johnson was sort of refusing to move, and eventually the next morning, I think it was, he resigned. But it was just fascinating to see all of that play out online, just completely online, in a way that I feel like it's just completely new.
Yeah. And I watched this brilliant, I was quite involved in trying to manage the BBC's coverage around the Queen's death and her funeral. And the BBC had made some preparations for this event, fair to say, including making some documentaries. There's a documentary on still on iPlayer, called My Government and I, and it's about all the prime ministers that the Queen had, and from Churchill obviously through to Liz Truss. And you look at those prime ministers now, oh my God, they wouldn't make it. I do sort of wonder if that's why we're getting through them so quickly, because the kind of scrutiny from social media and the requirement to, I think the requirement to be a good communicator in politics has massively increased, clearly, because some of them could hardly sort of string a sentence together, and that didn't seem to matter, anyway. But also being sort of reactive and engaged, and I'm not sure we've quite yet got to the generation of politicians that work right on the sort of platforms that people are using. I'm sure we will. The slightly older generation at the moment, I think, still there.
Yeah, it's true, but the sort of younger people are really online.
Much more reactive and responsive, engaged, see technology as sort of positive, as opposed to that sort of like, everybody's resigning on Twitter, I'm just going to stay here.
I think it's really
like this. Boris Johnson's reaction.
I think it's really true as well that it's changed how politics works in sort of technology. Well, I mean, just the way things have evolved in society really changed in that MPs now are much more independent minded, feel like they're, you know, accountable to their constituents and to the public in a sort of as individuals, in a way that before the sort of political party that we're in was more of a, you know, collective unit. I think it's true to say that, you know, MPs are more rebellious. So if they disagree with an aspect of government policy or their party policy, they are more inclined to vote against the whip. While, you know, before that would be something you only sort of do on very rare occasions if you really kind of fundamentally disagree with something. But now, because they feel like, and it is true that they will individually, you know, their voting records are online, their constituents look them up, send them letters, you know, everything is really closely scrutinized.
And they're held to account individually in a way that weren't necessarily like 20 years ago.
Exactly. I mean, they've got these social media profiles, they post their speeches on there that otherwise, you know, they give to the Commons, and then there was no kind of record of it. I mean, there was a written record, but it just wasn't in the same way. And yeah, I think that is part of the reason why we're seeing politics in such turmoil now, in that it's just much more difficult for individual MPs, but also prime ministers, because their parties, you know, there's a 70-seat majority, whatever it is now, 70-something seat Tory majority, but it just doesn't feel that way at all, because so many Tory MPs aren't inclined to follow the government, not just because of their individual views, but because of there's a lot of authority now with Boris Johnson gone and Liz Truss not having a mandate. But still, it's really interesting to see how little that majority means actually today. Yeah.
What else should we talk about? How long is Liz Truss going to be Prime Minister, do you think?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I keep checking my phone to check if she's resigned yet. Sometimes if it buzzes a lot.
Okay, we'll know if it buzzes a lot. Well, she's resigned. Okay.
Yeah. I was thinking it might happen today because the mood is so febrile, but no, I don't think we're quite at that stage yet. But it's definitely the case that MPs at least are talking about it as a matter of when, not if. And, you know, the discussion is, could it be before Christmas? You know, is it going to be until the spring? That she's under so much pressure, and it's really difficult to see how she survives, because she's refusing to change course, and that's really angering her own party. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe I feel like we'll probably need, it's so difficult to predict, because we need a kind of moment to tip the scale. And that's what happened with Boris Johnson, because it felt for a long time, for many months, that, you know, this just isn't sustainable and it's going to have to come to a head. And there was just a fairly random event that just meant that was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back, and that's when everybody started resigning, and he couldn't really form a cabinet anymore, so he had to go. And somebody was speaking to today was saying actually Liz Truss is probably more inclined to resign herself than Boris Johnson, whose character was always, you know, I'm just kind of defiant in that way, and everybody sort of thought he'd have to be forced out, which he was, rather than taking the initiative himself to go. And it's just a question of what that event that causes Liz Truss to say, you know what, I've had enough. I'm going, is going to be, I don't know, it could be something like the local elections, it could be something before that. What do you think?
I couldn't possibly comment. What about women in journalism? Should we talk about that? So how have you found it as a younger woman, kind of the beginning of your career, seeing what's ahead of you? How have you found it? But I should say, working in one of the most male-dominated, misogynistic environments, I'd say probably like in the country. That was one of the things actually I felt about Partygate, was that it sort of revealed a culture which most people are like, so what? You like drink at work? Like, we don't do that anymore. I mean, I know that journalists famously used to do that.
Yeah,
don't do that anymore. That was one of the things about that story, I think, that stood out. It just illustrated something about a real mismatch in culture between Westminster and the rest. So anyway, so how have you found it?
It's a really good question. I think I think mostly so far I've been surprised at how positive the environment is, in that there's such an awareness now of the need for more diversity in journalism, you know, more women in political journalism, more ethnic minorities, more young people, and it's just really, everybody agrees it's important, and there's an effort to address the kind of historic imbalance in terms of gender and sex and ethnic representation. So it's been really good in that sense, I've found, and as a young woman, you can kind of go about Westminster in many ways, you know, in the same way as a young man could. People will talk to you, you know, you do kind of, you are able to do the job because people are used to women doing this job now.
Yeah.
I'd say it's really interesting because as you go up the ranks, especially in newspapers, it does become a lot more male dominated.
Yeah.
And I've one thing that struck me is in terms of broadcasts, I think there is more of a visible balance, at least in terms of the correspondents and presenters, because it's just so visible. So if you switch on the BBC, you switch on Sky News, and they've just got a bunch of men, you know, on the rolling news channel 24 hours a day. People are going to think, hang on a second, this isn't very representative, it's not very diverse. While with the newspapers, it's just much less visible, so it's easier for them to get away with not as much kind of diversity. And I think the biggest challenge, and we talked about this a little bit before, and it's not something that's affected me yet, is that when you get to the point when you want to have children, I found that so many women in their sort of 30s drop out of political journalism, because it's just the hours are really intense, especially the last few years. I think Brexit was awful for that. So all these late night votes, just full day working days, you're always switched on. And it's just much more challenging if you've also got childcare responsibilities, and women usually have sort of bulk of them. And that's where there really needs to be more support. And that's a kind of national problem as well in terms of all jobs, I think, really, because there isn't that much support for young parents really in childcare. But that's how I found it. But in terms of actually doing the job, I've been pleasantly surprised in that there's so many other women in the lobby, and the lobby is just the word for journalists who work in Parliament, who have access to the House of Commons, House of Lords, and they get to speak to MPs, they get to go to government briefings. That's the sort of term for it. But yeah, there's a lot of women there, and all the politicians are used to women doing this job. So I've been pleasantly surprised in that sense.
I found that, I mean, I think probably in a similar way, like I arrived in the industry, television, I should say, is actually really female dominated, TV as opposed to news. So I was at a kind of half-day session with all the most senior people in television, radio, children's and sport today at the BBC. And I'd say, like, you know, probably 70% of them are women, which is pretty amazing. So like your whole Strictly team, all women, for example, you know, but also lots of documentaries. There's been a big shift in that, I would say, within TV more probably. And TV, just the TV bit, not the news bit, the TV is actually quite family friendly, I would say. And that was one of the reasons that I wanted to spend a bit of time there. So when I joined, I think the news industry, news is hugely demanding. Like, it's a hugely demanding job in terms of time, because, you know, it never stops, obviously. And when it stops somewhere, it's always something else is happening in the world. And you know, I've always found that really, really fun. And I think when I was joining the industry, similarly, there was a kind of like, maybe we should get some women. Should we get some women here? Maybe we need to get them along. And Channel 4 News was very aggressive in that way. And similarly, I always felt quite well supported and didn't experience what felt like sort of direct discrimination. But then when I had children, it was like, hold on a minute, how's this going to work? How does anybody do this? And I sort of looked around and realised that most people just left. And actually, when I got, it's not the case anymore, but it was the case at the BBC. When I then moved to the BBC, I've got 3 sons who are now 11, 8 and 5. And when I went to the BBC, I had my first child, and there weren't any women in senior positions there that had children. And that was a choice that, it's not even, it's like 10 years ago. It's not that long ago. And I got I actually got the Panorama job when I was pregnant with my third son. And so I did that. So I had a few months off, and then I did that job 5 years with 3 children under 5 and 3 children under 10. And it was quite intense. It was quite busy. And I definitely found it difficult, and I felt that both the kind of, yes, there's a bigger national issue around childcare and support for women. Yes, there's a massive kind of cultural issue around that sort of load, largely sitting with women. And my husband works in news as well, and I should say he's really good, and he does all the washing and quite a lot more besides, which I'm very grateful. But it's just a lot of work, that looking after children. But institutionally, I think within the most institutions, but certainly in the media, it's considered basically your problem. It's basically considered your choice. So there isn't really, I don't think, enough of a responsibility yet to say we value kind of mothers in the workplace, and therefore we will adapt and organise around that. Now, I should say, after like 5 years hard service at Panorama, I kind of got to the point that I said, I just think I need to take a bit of time off and just really meet my youngest son, who was about to go to school. Just introduce myself. And so the BBC did I took a career break. That option is available for the BBC. And again, that's one of those things that's good about big institutions, that they do tend to have flexible policies. So I was able to do that and then come back into a role which is much more family friendly and less pressurized. But I think that, my sort of feminism, I would say, really changed when I had children. And I really thought, okay, this is what difference feels like. This is why the gender pay gap is so significant, because, and I think COVID massively exacerbated that, because you just get to it's a rational choice when you've got 2 earners in the house, one is earning more. It's rational for the woman to just say, do you know what, like, this is mad, we can't do this.
I'm going to stop working.
And just step away.
Especially when you've got to pay that full salary equivalent to childcare. If you're paid for childcare, that's the thing.
Yeah. So I feel like I've sort of come out of that a bit now. Of it does, motherhood does really change as your children get older, and I've come out of that kind of really young child bit, but I still feel quite sort of radicalized to try and improve things for mothers within the media and within news.
And I think so history teaches us that women like you, when they get there and they make, they kind of make it clear that this is a problem.
And try and set an example. So every time anybody came to me, woman or man on my team, and said, I'm pregnant or my wife's having a baby, I'd be like, you have to take the whole year off. And then to the men, I'd be like, you have to share that parental leave. You have to. It's really good for, culture, workplace, your relationship with your children, like generally being a better parent, So sort of leading by example, and I think it's a really important part of that.
Well, I don't know if we want to take questions from from people.
Has anybody got any questions?
Thank you.
Sorry. I didn't normally need one. Can you hear me even better now? You talked in really quite a positive way of your experiences as women in the workplace. You haven't spoken, and I thought you would, talking about men patronizing you or the sort of feeling small in the office. Is that because you didn't experience that, or because it just didn't matter to you so much?
Oh, that's it. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I definitely have experienced that. I don't I don't get too bothered by it, I think. And I think that thinking about a career in journalism, we were just talking with Prescott about kind of what the skills are in journalism, and I think presentation and communication is a really important part of that, because really in any news organisation, there is a moment in the day or in the week where you all sit down and say, right, so what stories are we going to do? And at that point, who has the loudest voice really, or has the most convincing argument, really, really matters. So when I went to Newsnight, Jeremy Paxman was still there. And so I had to work with Jeremy, who had quite forthright opinions about a lot of subjects. And generally what I would try to do is, just sort of respond where in the same fashion.
Yes.
Sort of mirror that behaviour first. And I think there is a lot of, you say a really good idea and then some bloke says the same idea and then everyone's like, hey, that's such a good idea. And you're just like, hold on a minute. But I think kind of I've always just taken the view, like, consistently delivering, consistently being across your stories, and it counts. And I think it's kind of worked for me. Yeah. Counts as much as just shouting, basically. What have you found in terms of mansplaining?
I think broadly so far I've been fortunate in that I've never worked anywhere where there was a particular colleague who was really sexist or anything like that. So generally the places I've worked have been really good in that way. I've definitely been in a lot of all male meetings. Yeah. That's definitely male dominated. Even
intimidating.
It really is, yeah, especially sort of older, like really close to you, and then you kind of feel like you haven't got anything of value you just sort of sit there frozen. And that was it took me really quite a while to sort of muster up the courage to be able to, and that's why it's such a critical skill that it's difficult to, and you cannot, it's the only way to learn how to do it is just practice, and you kind of build your confidence. There's definitely, writing about politics and speaking to politicians, there's a lot of kind of old-fashioned people around still who patronizing. Yeah, who kind of just have this, seem to believe that you're not going to get what they're talking about. You're not as intelligent as them, or, you're just kind of a young woman who. And I just find, the thing is, they're on the way out anyway. It's to be brutally honest, and people like that, it's just not really worth. Because the job really is about getting to know people, developing them into contacts that speak to you regularly. It's just not worth bothering with them. Because if there's somebody who treats you in that way, you're just going to think, fine, well, you're not going to be much use. And clearly you are sexist. And but
I think it's an interesting point because both of us have said, like, actually, we don't really bother calling it out. We just like work around.
Yeah, that's true.
And, maybe that's not quite right. I think if I I'm now in a position where sometimes I'm chairing meetings. And I suppose that kind of role modeling good behaviour thing, I really make an effort to include everybody. And if somebody's been interrupted by somebody else, I'll always make sure we go to that person, and kind of trying to manage some of those situations, I think, as well, is the responsibility of the organisation, whoever the organisation is. Yeah.
So my question is, if you would describe yourself as feminist, did you come to King's already feminist? Was there something at King's that helped you develop it, or perhaps not? Or did you become more feminist when you got into the workplace and realized you needed it?
I think I came to, as I say, I don't understand anybody who isn't a feminist. That's my sort of starting position, I think always has been. So I think I definitely came to King's as a feminist, but what being a feminist has meant to me and the way that I suppose sort of articulate that, or I think has changed. I think I see it through different eyes, defined and shaped by my experiences, and as I say, some of that is personal experience and having children, and some of that is kind of what you see when you're covering stories like, Donald Trump, as an example. I mean, that there's a lot you can say about Donald Trump, but he wasn't really there he had a particular view of women, let's say. So in terms of Kings, it's interesting actually, like I think that probably the experience that shaped me most at King's. So I had a really great tutor. But I also had, when we were doing SPS, I don't know if it's always the case in SPS, but we were really strong group of women, basically. I think it was like there was Daniel Blaney and Andy and everyone else was just like a really mouthy woman, and we were all there because basically we loved politics and we loved having arguments, and I think that kind of sisterhood, I suppose I hadn't had that before particularly, and so it probably made my feminism a bit sort of sharper, and it also gave me a chance to learn about feminism as well, like formally. I think that the experience that really shaped me most at King's, which is actually more sort of men, women than it is nose on feminism, was that I was on the college council. I think I was on the college council for 2 years, and the thing I wanted to do most was improve disabled access, and I wanted to build a ramp in the front court, and I worked so hard to get that through college council, right? And I learned all about lobbying and how you try and persuade people. We did budgets, so it's really committed to it. And it's interesting because I now realize as well, I'm interested in changing institutions, I think, more than I am just the kind of the political power, changing institutions. And we got it through college council. Then we just had to take it to the governing body. And we got to the governing body and it was lit. I mean, I can't remember the name of my other college council rep who was in the year above me. And I mean, I'm sure things have changed now at King's, but at the time, I mean, it was like 75% men. And they basically just laughed at us, and that was it. It was over.
And it didn't happen.
No, it didn't happen. It's happened now. Yes. And it's probably happened now. It probably happened when it happened because it was a legal requirement. But it was one of those moments where you sort of think you're one thing in a place, and we're going to do something there, and then you realize there's a group of people who view you in a completely different way, which was young, naive, and ultimately only here for 3 years. So we weren't going to change anything. Sorry, I got that. There was a lot of fellows within that were really encouraging and supportive. But I was reflecting on it because I still do. I'm doing a huge amount of work around disability within TV, and it's still like access, just access. Just are there ramps? Are signs big? All of that kind of stuff just like nowhere. And so I sometimes reflect on that, but it was a hugely valuable lesson for me in what it takes to achieve change. So yeah, I think King's taught me a lot, and some of that was about what feminism means as well. Wow. What about you?
Yeah, really similarly to you, I came here and I always, when I was a student at school, I just became a feminist because it's that when you're kind of a teenager and you're growing up and you start realizing that in some ways you're treated differently to other ways, and just kind of those basic, and that kind of radicalizes you and you think, yeah, I'm a feminist. So yeah, definitely. And so I definitely came here with that mind frame, but I really valued like you. I mean, here the environment here, I found that was so friendly to women in many ways, and that, you know, there was a women's dinner. The annual women's dinner was just such a lovely event. All sorts of events like that, so women's only events. I mean, this event, there was just so much of that going on that it really helped me with that way, and I did develop. And as you say, like as you grow older, just in different ways, you recognize the different challenges at different ages that women face. So yeah, I mean, I guess came here as one, but I definitely developed that.
Any other questions?
So you both spoke about an interest in politics before you started journalism. Do you think having an interest in like a specific area such as politics or like science, do you think that hinders you in any way than something like a more broad interest?
Does it hinder us, you say? I think no, not at all. I think it's a real advantage. And especially in journalism, I think the best way to establish yourself and to get to know the trade and to get into it is to have a specialism often, or at least an area. I mean, even within politics, it can be better to have a more specific interest, because unless you have that, you're kind of scrambling around. I mean, you know, news is there's all sorts of news. And if you can be interested in everything, but it really does help you if you've got a specific interest that you have. Because you develop more knowledge about that, and it's really good to kind of become the person who is following a particular area and kind of establish yourself as the kind of the expert almost in that, or the kind of main journalist covering that. So I think it's a really good thing actually, and it really helps, because otherwise you can end up feeling a little bit lost, and you're competing with everybody else who a lot of them will have kind of expertise, and if you're just otherwise just doing a bit of everything, it can be difficult to establish yourself.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like I think thinking about what you're most interested in, like naturally, instinctively, because you've got to be really interested in the thing that you're going to report on, and focusing on that is really, really useful, because it enables you to sort of make a name for yourself within that subject. And that can be lots of things. You know, we've just been talking about politics, because we basically both really like politics. But you know, social affairs, for example, or it might be a region or an area of the country that you get to know really well, or it's just, you know, science. And I think, because really, like in terms of the skills around journalism, within broadcasting, so within TV and radio, you know, there's a certain amount. It's brilliant if you know how to edit. It's brilliant if you know. I'll just move away from something. It's brilliant if you know how to make your own pieces. Within papers or written, you know, being a good writer is really important. But beyond that, it really comes down to sources and interest and instinct. So I think, you know, it's interesting. Now I'm 15 years into my career, the people that I started with, those contacts they've built up over years, whether it be in politics or in business, or even in the environment, science, they're the people who kind of moved up along with them, and they remain really useful people contacts to give you stories and talk to. And I think that there's been a number of events. I mean, COVID is over the last few years where you've seen the real value of specialist journalism, and COVID was an example of that, where suddenly the expertise of the health journalists or the science journalists became so valuable. I suspect the expertise of the economics and the business reporters over the next 6 months will become really useful. And Tim Harford, actually, he writes for the Financial Times, and he does a program on Radio 4 called More or Less. He's doing a new economics podcast, which I think will be really good for helping people understand. Suddenly we're all going to need to know more about it. So I think having a specialism is an advantage. But at the same time, if you feel like what motivates you and what you're interested in is just what's going on, I'd encourage you to think about an internship in a newsroom where they will place you on different desks. So you would have an opportunity to see which subject you're most interested in.
And one thing that I never really thought about before I started was, because with this job, your job becomes your life. So, you know, if you're a political journalist, you're just thinking about it, consuming news in that area like all day. It is okay sometimes to just like, there'll be a day or an evening or an afternoon where you're like, I just do not want to read another thing about politics today. Yeah. I just want to switch off. And it might be that you love the subject, but just because it becomes all consuming. And sometimes that can give you a little bit of a crisis, like, oh my God, have I, you know, is this like, do I hate it now? But no, there's definitely, because it just becomes your life, you do sometimes just feel like you want to take a step away from it.
And also I think outside of politics, like you're often dealing with some like really difficult things. You know, a lot of the news stories that you cover are really sad. And actually, I mean, it's sort of stopped now, but there was this period where there were quite a lot of terror attacks. And I remember when I was at Newsnight and I was pregnant, and MH17, which was this, I think it was the plane that was shot down actually by the Russians. And I just thought, I just don't want to. You know, most people don't live their lives just constantly staring at terrible things happening to people. I can't, I've got nothing to kind of bring to this anymore. I've got no original take on a terror attack or some terrible tragedy in people's lives. And anyway, then I went on maternity leave, it was all fine. But you know, so I think that it's healthy to feel like that too, and it's how most of the audience feel. So that's why you kind of in the kind of bigger picture, when you're thinking about editing a website or a TV news program or a radio program, it's not as kind of simple as light and shade, which is the sort of like say all the bad things have happened and then tell a joke at the end. It used to be the structure. But I think it's about thinking about stories that are positive as well, and coming back to stories that people remember and sort of helping people fill in the gaps, what happened to that community or what happened to that place. So I try and think about that as well, because I think a long-standing criticism of journalists, which you know, sort of peaked around the Leveson inquiry, which was about hacking and really the abuse of victims. So a kind of group, I mean, there were some celebrities, but there were also people who's, you know, had family members murdered or terrible things had happened to them, and then they were being harassed by the media. I think that made everybody in the industry think a lot more about the duty of care that we have, both towards our journalists in terms of not putting pressure on people to get stories, but also in terms of people who find themselves at the centre of media stories, particularly when they're not, you know, it is not by their own design. So I've done quite a lot of work with various sort of groups who've come together post the Manchester terror attack, and other sort of tragedies, to think about what's the right way to mediate those relationships. People, you know, find themselves in the middle of terrible stories, and then suddenly they're exposed to the media, usually in a very short term, like 1 week or 2 weeks kind of way, and it makes that experience so much worse. So that's a kind of responsibility that the media needs to understand. I mean, it's also a responsibility that television needs to understand, I think, because obviously there's been some of those conversations around Love Island and different reality programs which construct characters, and then you know, once that show's over, what's the responsibility that broadcast has to that person? I'd say it's quite significant. So thinking about through all those subjects, I think is something that the industry is sort of grappling with. I've gone a long way from the original question, sorry. Oh yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming to speak to us here and like your
Thanks for coming to hear us.
It's been really, really lovely. I was just wondering, kind of over the past 5 years, obviously there's been like massive political turmoil, and you've been working on that. So is there one event that kind of stands out as the most memorable to you, where you kind of, you remember where you were and you remember it just had like a bit of a big impact on you, because you know, been through so much over the last 5 years. So yeah, it's just curious.
Oof. There's there are quite a lot. It's just been extraordinary. I mean, I've been doing this job since, like, political journalism since the autumn of 2018, so it's been 4 years, and it's just been, there's been a really kind of unnaturally high number of really extraordinary political events. I mean, there's been 3 prime ministers in that time. For me, it's definitely I've spoken about it a little bit already, but the Boris Johnson resignation and that whole 48 hours, I mean, it was really recent now, just in July. But I just remember I was meeting somebody. I went for a drink with somebody that I was talking to because I thought they'd be a useful contact. And it was, we were talking about China and, you know, the government, the UK's foreign policy generally, and its stance towards China, which is a really interesting topic, really big topic at the moment. We were in this kind of deli near Green Park, and I was just sitting there with this woman, and we were having a really good conversation. And my phone kept buzzing, as I was saying before. And I still have this, I'm just like wondering whether something has happened now, because I haven't checked my phone.
It's a really healthy profession, then.
It's
you can tell. It doesn't mess with your attention span at all.
Awful. And at some point started ringing, and it was my editor, and I was like, oh, it's a bit annoying actually, because I'm doing this meeting, but never mind, I'll pick it up. And she was saying, you know, where are you? Can you file a story on this, you know, in like 5 minutes? And I was like, hang on, I hadn't seen anything. And she said, oh, well, Rishi Sunak's resigned, and Sajid Javid has also resigned within minutes of each other, the Chancellor and Health Secretary. And it's all kind of falling apart. And I thought, oh my God. And I left, and there was some reason that the tube wasn't running or something, so I had to walk all the way. I kind of like marched all the way from Green Park to Parliament. And that was just the start of like 2 really extraordinary days where we had the whole series of ministerial resignations, starting off with Sunak and Javid, and then just at every level, all sorts of people resigning within minutes of each other. And meanwhile, Boris Johnson refusing to go, and eventually, you know, at that night tried to game plan a way to stay in, and only kind of accepted that he was going to have to go when they realized they just didn't have enough people to fill, were willing to go into cabinet. I mean, there were people that he'd appointed a replacement for his chancellor. He got Nadine Zahawi in, and other people who were loyal to him, and even they were saying that he had to go. So
It's so funny the way that he's now referred to as the former chancellor, because it's like, I'm sure you were really chancellor for about 48 hours.
And within that time, he kind of came back and forth in terms of whether he thought Boris was just, it was all kind of really weird. And it was just work was, I just slept very little, and was constantly, and it was also the spectator party that the next day, which is a really big, you know, it's itself a news event, because all Boris Johnson had just resigned, and all the various potential successors of Sunak, Liz Truss, Nadine Zahawi, all other people who wanted to become Prime Minister, use that as the first place to start talking to their colleagues, you know, rolling the pitch. And I went to that, and it was just completely surreal, because you're just seeing these really important people that I don't, you know, it's difficult to get access to quite that level. Just drinking in the Spectator's garden, and all that kind of playing out, the kind of the battle to become Prime Minister was just unforgettable.
Yeah, I'm not quite so, I don't quite live and breathe it in quite the same way now, but the Brexit vote for me was like, I mean, I was working at Newsnight at that point. I really remember we did loads, obviously we just did loads in the run up to it. But I remember we did one all about the law, just a whole programme with, and at that point, Evan Davis was the presenter, just about the legal implications of Brexit. We left, and you know, I think a lot of organisations honestly covered that campaign quite badly, like quite superficially, and a bit like, oh, I don't know what's going to happen, who knows, you know, on the one hand, on the other, and all that. And we did it in a lot of depth. But I remember right at the end of the programme, there was a lawyer there who said, I think it might be illegal under the Good Friday Agreement. And Evan Davis just went, well, I'm afraid that's the end of the programme. So hold on a minute, that was the thing. So when the Brexit referendum happened, that was a massive moment that I was like, okay, this is massive for our country, because it told us something about our country that I think a lot of people in the media hadn't realised. But also we knew that it was a story that was going to play out over 10 years, you know, and as well as in 24 hours, like obviously David Cameron was going to resign, all those things that then triggered. And I do think there's a really interesting story to tell from that vote to this budget, that the mini budget that's still being referred to as mini, the most consequential budget over the last 30 years. There is a direct line and story that you can tell there about politics and how it's changed. So I remember that really clearly. And then the other thing I remember was when Boris Johnson went into intensive care. And it was like, oh, you know, that was a moment where COVID went from a sort of like, oh, this is weird. What's this all going to mean? And personally, I never got around to baking bread. I was just trying to keep the program. Yeah. But that I remember that really clearly as a sort of a moment where that became, you know, it was a political crisis as well as a sort of health one. I think those moments, there's always what's that phrase, you know, there's something about a decade can happen in a week. It's like nothing can happen for a decade, and then a decade can happen in a week, where you have a series of political events that feel so consequential. But I would honestly say this now is one of those moments, because I think that aside from how long is Liz Truss going to last, I just think there's a shift going on politically, and you can sort of feel it. And some of it is natural, like when a party's been in power for 10 years, it's just they're tired, and the day-to-day becomes overwhelming. But I think there's a shift going on in politics, and then when you feel like something's happened that is actually affecting the nation, and you know, there's certainly been some decisions, haven't there, that will affect individuals a lot. So yeah, I would say Brexit and Boris Johnson, and then yeah, the rest of the last three have been a bit of a blur to me, because I've had the last three prime ministers.
The online audience can't hear me unless I'm speaking to the microphone. So thank you so much to all of you who've come today in person and online. And thank you so much to our speakers. Such great insights, humour, and thoughts for the future. I hope you follow us as we pursue the campaign for the coming weeks and months. And the next step is to join us next door for some drinks. So thank you very much.